Alright guys, this is going to be the second game we have here. This will be a matchup against goblins, and goblins is a thing that, like elves, is starting to show up a little bit more. Before the bans, we had a version of elves and goblins that did show up from time to time, but where they're really starting to gain strength is in these certain daily events where you have a lot of Fissure Storm variants. What they allow the player to do is they're pretty good at resetting the board state. When Fissure Storm goes off, it of course is going to return all of your permanents, and the way that decks are starting to gain an advantage in a similar way to Affinity is that they are able to replay the board state. They're able to drop their creatures fast and regain their presence before the Fissure version has a chance to beat them. So this game is going to be a bit biased. I'll kind of spoil it right here. My opponent does get a bit mana screwed, but I still wanted to showcase this because I think it shows at least one of the good matchups for teachings. I know there are, you see the first game there against Stompy. There are quite a few bad game ones that we can actually have in this current metagame. Different versions of Affinity can also be trouble because of the fact that they run so many of those 4 toughness creatures. Mirror Enforcer and the Carapace are just 2 examples, and Fling can get all kinds of troublesome with a Tog. A lot of your kill spells are actually minus spells. Things like Disfigure you see here and Agony Warp will give you options to kill creatures, but what it's going to require you to do is only minus. And what the Tog can do in response is simply sacrifice an artifact to get it beyond the point where that spell will be a successful kill. So I did want to at least show one of the favorable matchups. And you do, if we keep seeing, we've seen a couple of daily events recently where Fissure has shown to the point where there is 8 or more Fissure decks in the showings. And if that is a continued trend, what you'll start to see is an increase in things like Elves and Goblins and Affinity. And so I think it's important to showcase this matchup. I'm adding this disclaimer, I guess, because I don't want it to be entirely misleading. I don't want you to see these videos and go, oh, look, this had a great matchup here. It played really well. And so this is obviously the thing to beat. I think, unfortunately, you're at a real kind of stale spot with Dimir, where it has potential, but it's not necessarily at that point yet. It's got a very niche area that it can be successful in, and it's going to depend on what kind of transpires from here out and whether or not you see a lot more of those 4 toughness creatures. The board state gets increasingly better, obviously, after sideboarding in those matches because of the fact that you have options for anti-artifact, and you can add in more direct kill through more edicts or more Doomblades. But that's getting off topic. Let's focus in on this game. Opening hand was pretty good, I guess. You have 2 lands available to you that do come in the different colors, which is fantastic. More importantly, you do get the double Disfigure. One of the key things for teachings is to maintain the early game through these cheap kill spells. So seeing a double Disfigure in the opening hand is pretty awesome, especially when you have the black mana to make it happen. Obviously, that's where we're going to start off, so that when if our opponent makes that early play, and there are a lot of turn 1 plays that are creatures, you can get down, Young Wolf, you can get down any number of Nettle Sentinel. There are Llanowar Elves, and of course any number of Goblins that Disfigure can target down on that first turn. So getting that turn 1 Disfigure against the turn 1 creature is going to be something that you see a lot. Having the blue mana available, there are instances where you want to start with the blue to get the counterspell, but it's more important here to start with the Disfigure and hope that you find that second island to eventually get that counterspell. And that'll come, obviously, as the third drop if it happens, and that's a pretty good point because you will have the mana available to counterspell, and in this particular matchup still have mana to Disfigure. Now, when it comes to Goblins, these are the ones you want to look out for. Things like the Cohort here, they have the ability, they're cheap and they come in at a good size for the cost, but the drawback is that they can't attack unless a creature spell is cast. Now, keys there are, first off, the fact that if they don't cast a creature, this one can't attack. So there are times where there are more important things to kill, such as a Sledder. The other key thing there is that it cannot attack unless a creature spell has been cast. This means if he casts a creature and I counterspell it, even though that second creature that he tried to put into play didn't actually enter the battlefield, it still allows the Cohort the chance to attack you because of the fact that he did cast it. It doesn't say that the spell has to be successful. So that's something to keep in mind. So obviously drew into the second island here, which is fantastic, going to just pass the turn away. We could evoke a Muldrifter. There's not a lot of point in this particular matchup when we do have 2 Disfigures and a counterspell available. I'm going to work on controlling the early game and wait to that point in time. Usually Teachings does a pretty good job of not missing land drops, so you can get that Muldrifter in on turn 5. Now he attempts to put a Sledder here, and this is where you'll see that instance where I am going to prevent the creature from entering the battlefield, but because he did cast it, he is going to be still able to attack with the cohort. I felt that the Sledder was a good option to keep off the field. With the ability of the Sledder, as you can see here, to get around certain spells when it gets bigger, it's a similar thing to a Tog, where a Tog can get bigger and prevent the damage off of a Disfigure or an Agony Warp. Sledder is not as critical because it can sacrifice off only goblins, whereas a Tog can sacrifice lands or useless things like a drum. And keep its creature base alive. In this matchup, the Sledder is not as powerful as an Tog would be because he can only kill off creatures, so he has to really consider whether or not he wants to trade, keep the Sledder alive in favor of sacrificing something else. And in this particular case, he would have to sacrifice 2 goblins in order to get past a Disfigure. So it's not nearly as powerful. However, I still like to keep it off the board because it gives him some options to get around certain counter spells. I mean targeted kill. Now, he only has 1 land in play. Like I said, he does get a little behind on mana, unfortunately for him, but this is kind of like Stompy, where Stompy can get away with just sitting on 2 lands all game and have plenty of opportunity to play kill spells in the forms of Lightning Bolt, as well as creatures, since its curve is so low. Drawn into an Aqueduct here, we don't really have any plays other than this figures, so we're just going to simply put that into play and make sure you're returning an island here as opposed to a swamp, and we still have the mana open for the Disfigure. It's going to put down another creature card. It's going to allow him to attack with the cohort, and the Raider is going to be just that second version of the Sledder, so it's going to be something that I might look to target down. Again, it gives you that opportunity where you force your opponent to think whether or not it's worth it to sacrifice another creature in favor of it, especially when it comes down to this particular scenario where it's going to take 2 to get past the Disfigure. So, drawing into Evolving Wilds, I am going to put the island into play first. This is allowing me to play the Muldrifter and refill my hand back to 7. Very important in this matchup that I want to have as many kill spells as possible so that we can get through whatever number of goblins my opponent will put down. It's also going to give me a good blocker. If he does decide to attack through, I can choose to block and trade, and that's something I'm going to be very willing to do. It won't give me an opportunity, obviously, to switch in the Ninja off of this Muldrifter, but having a second Muldrifter in hand gives me that opportunity later on. Having these 2 Disfigures and then drawing a third puts me in a really good position against this deck. I'm basically going to be able to trade for one of these if he decides to attack and have 3 kill spells available later on. As soon as he empties his hand out, you see he's in a pretty good spot as far as hand size goes because of the fact that he's stuck on 1 land. So it's going to give me some opportunities to really get this game under control and on this draw, and it's really just a really incredible draw for this particular matchup, I will say that. So unfortunate for my opponent, he does get mana screwed, but I think, again, I wanted to showcase this particular game because of the fact that the draw turned out so well, and to show that this deck does have some really great matchups. So he does decide to attack here. I am obviously going to choose to block the cohort. It's really hit or miss. I could take the chance to block the Raider, and in order to keep that Raider alive, he would have to sacrifice both goblins, which is definitely card advantage in my favor. But again, having these Disfigures in hand, this game is pretty well under control. I'm going to be able to now, if I get the opportunity, put in another Muldrifter. I have 2 Evolving Wilds, which is going to really stabilize my mana base. It is turn 6, and you see I have not missed a land drop, which is fantastic. It's what you want in this deck. So, gonna put down that Muldrifter, again, refilling my hand. And giving me more options to kill things off. You see I draw into a Doomblade here. I am going to have 8 cards. It's pretty easy here to discard a Teachings because of the flashback, or the Evolving Wilds because we are pretty set on land, and like I said, we have not missed a drop, so I can feel free to get rid of that Evolving Wilds and not feel too tense. We also have a lot of our early game kill, so we can use very little mana and still obtain the same results. So, still no land for my opponent. Like I said, unfortunately a very bad draw for him, which makes this video a little less worthwhile, but I still feel that it's worth showing this. So decides to kill off the Muldrifter here, and he's going to be able to swing through for damage. You see this is an instance where, because he only had 1 land and decided to play the Chain Lightning to kill off the Muldrifter instead of a creature, he is unable to actually attack with this Conscript, and that's where you want to be aware of things like that. So I'm going to just take the 1 damage, and this is fine. Teachings is going to find itself in a scenario where it's going to take a lot of early game damage if it does not get a decent draw. What you're trying to do in the same way that Dimir Post or Is It Post does is get to that mid to late game, and that's really your sweet spot, and that's where the deck really gets going. So going to sacrifice off this Evolving Wilds to get our land into play, and now we've set ourselves up for a really great play here. What we have in play is 6 lands, and so what we're going to do here is start off by disfiguring the conscripts. Again, doesn't really matter which one we target, and we're going to see some of the direct card advantage here as that goes to the graveyard, because we now have enough mana left over at 5 to replay this Disfigure through Archaeomancer. So we're going to simply tap out here, making sure to leave the 1 black mana open. This gets back my Disfigure, and that's going to give me the opportunity to kill this Raider. He does concede here because this game's obviously in my pocket, even though he is still at 20 life. But you see what great benefit we get off of things like this Archaeomancer. We talk about card advantage and the way that is achieved through not only finding things with teachings and card draw, but when you get reuse of the Archaeomancer, if you're using Ghostly Flicker and you can get that back, this 3 copies of Disfigure that I did draw and that I do have total in my deck all of a sudden becomes 4 or more because of the fact that this Archaeomancer gives me that opportunity to get it back. So, you know, it's limited to 3, and this is why you can get away with that toolbox of a smaller selection of spells at 1, 2, and 3 instead of 4 ofs. And it gives us that opportunity to reuse these and turn that disadvantage of having less than 4 into an advantage.